There we are. Good morning, all. Nice to see you. I'm going to start with some background about this investigation. I'm then going to make a statement about what we found, and then I'll have some time to take your questions. So, first, the background. This investigation stemmed from a referral from the Legislative Council in February of 2022. You'll find a copy of the referral in the report on page 18, if you haven't seen that already. Now, when I'm referred matters from Parliament, I must investigate them. I have no choice, but how I investigate them is up to me. This investigation relates to item D in that referral. I tabled my report into items A to C in July 2022. So for the sharp-eyed among you who note there are still items E and F, I can advise that I've written to the President of the Council today to say that this investigation and the Operation Watts investigation have covered those items as far as practicable, bearing in mind they make no allegations we could discern. Investigating this referral was not straightforward. It alleged that ALP activists had been stacked into the public service, referencing an article in The Age in 2021. It is unusual to be required to investigate allegations in a newspaper article, which ranged over far more territory than ALP activists being stacked and did not use those terms anyway. So, to give meaning to the referral, I published a paper in May of last year inviting submissions from interested parties to help us identify examples of alleged politicisation. The response was both overwhelming and fearful from current and former senior public servants. The submissions phase closed at the end of July last year. All were analysed, from which we decided to investigate scenarios involving more than a dozen public sector bodies, ranging from isolated executive appointments to bulk hiring and firing. Some were consolidated and others discontinued as the investigation progressed, sometimes because there was no evidence of a problem, and other times because potential witnesses were afraid to speak to us. Some of the matters we examined appear as case studies in this report, but the fear factor is why the report contains no names of the people we spoke to, although a small number will be identifiable, and why in many of these cases I'm unable to provide the level of detail of the evidence I would have wished. Not all departments and agencies were alleged to be politicised, and this is important to note. Several 100,000 dedicated public sector workers carry on their business, serving the public without question or controversy. This report is not about them. We found politicisation in the level of the public sector that deals with ministers, usually in the form of over-responsiveness to their preferences. It was not everywhere, but more common when major infrastructure development and job creation was the desired political goal, not coincidentally those areas required to deliver major election promises. The numbers will speak for themselves, but in effect this investigation was the equivalent of about 5 major investigations. We followed the evidence as far as we could, but we also note where we were unable to go further. The main reasons for this were witness reluctance, cabinet secrecy, and poor record keeping. We did not and had no need to interview the current or former Premier or ministers. The evidence did not point there, or if it did, would have been blocked by provisions that do not allow me access to cabinet material. So, what did we find? We did not find widespread stacking of the public service with ALP activists. We did find instances where people's reputations for impartiality had been unfairly sullied by stints in ministerial offices, sometimes many years previously. We found cases where the justification for appointments was questionable, but the evidence was simply lacking. But we did find a public sector that had been politicised in other equally pervasive ways. We found the Premier had roughly as many staffers as the Prime Minister, New South Wales Premiers combined. Creeping politicisation is a reality in Victoria and requires urgent attention. Politicisation can take many forms. It is not just the hiring of people with political affiliations. It is also the closing down or marginalisation of apolitical, independent voices. An example of this was the early assessment of the suburban rail loop. It was subject to excessive secrecy, including from the responsible department head. It was proved up by consultants rather than developed by public servants. And its announcement blindsided the agency set up by the same government to remove short-term politics from infrastructure planning. The lack of rigorous public sector scrutiny over such projects before they are announced poses obvious risks to public funds. While it is impossible to quantify the impact of marginalisation on either the public interest or the public purse, we should all be worried about the trend. We also found widespread perception of politicisation, undermining confidence that hiring decisions are made on merit. We found frequent direct appointments of former ministerial staffers, rushed and shoddy recruitment practices, poor record keeping and opaque selection methods. Perception matters. Not only must merit selection be done, it must be seen to be done. Disregarding this principle makes it less likely that the public sector will attract and retain capable leaders. The quality and candour of advice upon which important decisions are made will suffer. Confidence in the neutrality of the public service will be shaken. We were also troubled by the number of public servants who were afraid to contribute, fearing if they spoke up, were in any way identifiable as having done so, their careers would be finished. Whatever the truth of the question at the heart of this investigation, a culture of fear in the upper echelons of the public sector does not support frank and fearless advice. The report identified 4 key areas for reform and makes 8 recommendations which speak to the need for greater independence in the appointment of public officials. But nothing will change without a recognition at the highest levels of government that change is necessary. If this report does not convince those with the power to change, I must leave it to the public to judge for themselves. Thank you, and Katrina will facilitate your questions.
Question. Just hands up or?
No, sure.
Yes, Simon.
Ombudsman, how inhibited were you by the cabinet confidentiality in this investigation?
Very much so. I mean, we identify in the report numerous examples of where we simply could not answer the question. I mean, some of the answers to the suburban rail loop are shrouded in cabinet secrecy, which I'm simply unable to access.
So does that mean this report?
And that's, you know,
does that mean this report is incomplete because of the cabinet confidentiality?
It is incomplete in 3 areas. So there are 3 reasons why this report does not go as far as I would have liked. And one of them was witness reluctance, one of them is cabinet secrecy, and one of them is and the other is poor record keeping. They are all significant factors as to about limitations that we experienced in investigating this matter. But cabinet secrecy is certainly was a significant block in a number of the areas where we sought to go.
Talk about you dropped inquiries into one important matter because of welfare concerns. What was that important matter?
Well, I am clearly not going to tell you the answers to those questions. That was the reason we dropped it. Now, I would have liked to have included much more detail and many more examples in this report, but what I was not going to do was coerce witnesses who were concerned about their livelihoods, or include matters that would have an impact or even risked having an impact on people's livelihoods.
Is there anything you can tell us about, I guess, the level of seriousness of those allegations and those investigations that you've been pursuing?
I cannot say any more than this report already says. There were instances where And the culture of fear manifested itself in many different ways. You know, we do know that the report was downloaded by many more people than actually spoke to us. People told us when they contacted the submissions line about the fear factor. Sometimes people spoke to us initially and then were reluctant to go further. Sometimes people spoke to us and told us about an incident or a scenario involving other people, and when we contacted them, they were afraid to talk to us. Sometimes we went as far as, investigating scenarios, and at the last stage, people were afraid for that to appear in the report. So I cannot say more about the scenarios, but I can talk broadly about, this is not a single instance. It was very widespread.
Is there a particular moment during the investigation that genuinely left you really shocked?
It's the fear factor was certainly disturbing. This was a complex and sort of multi-headed investigation, as I hope I've made clear from the background, and there were sort of many moments in there where you're basically chasing rabbits down holes and the path is blocked. So there were certainly moments of frustration and indeed, to the point of really feeling quite disturbed.
There's references in...
Can I actually invite Katrina to
There's references in here to other reports into public service, whether it be robo debt.
Yeah.
I wonder about that general, more broad trend that we're seeing in the public service, and I wondered your opinion on why, I guess, there has either been a perception of politicisation or people in the public service not understanding their role. Instead of that frank and fearless advice, trying to, implement policies instead of push back. It's obviously great examples in here of Victoria, but it's more widespread than that. How have we got to that situation?
Well, it is more widespread, and it is much more complex. And this is why the report is much more complex and nuanced than a single allegation of stacking of a public service with activists, which we did not find. There were many aspects to this, and as I said earlier, many aspects of what politicisation means that are far more complex and nuanced, much more subtle, in fact, but equally, if not more, pervasive and pernicious. Some of those are trends that we have seen around Australia, and they have been commented on in reports elsewhere, most recently the Robo-Debt Royal Commission. And I single that out because it does make it describes the trend of over-responsiveness to the government of the day, which I think everybody recognises needs to be pulled back, and I think we're seeing that trend looking to be reversed in the Commonwealth, and it needs to happen here too.
And if I can get another one, you talk about the number of staff in the PPO. To a lot of people in this room, we'd understand the effect of that, but to the public, what's your message about the problem with the number of people comparative to other offices, and what sort of effect does that have?
But I'm not providing a commentary on the size of the PPO or Department of Premier and Cabinet or others that speak to centralisation of power. But when you have a public service that is being where its senior leaders are being marginalised, it is reasonable for governments to look for sources of advice from outside the public service. They're not the sole source of advice, but they are the traditional source of independent and, as we say, frank and fearless advice. And we ignore that at our peril.
Yep.
You mentioned record keeping. Have you noticed a trend in your time about people not wanting to leave a paper trail in certain situations? Is that something that's a cause of concern in public service?
The reasons for poor record keeping are many and varied, and we don't explore them in detail. Some of it may be deliberate, and some of it may be just plain sloppy.
But it really hampered your work. You said that most of your lines of inquiry were hindered in some way.
At some point, record keeping is an issue at various levels.
You've made findings about the number of people in the Premier's private office. What were you able to establish about what those people actually do, what their roles actually are?
I haven't made findings about them. I've simply stated a number. I make no commentary about that. Much of this is anecdotal. I mean, in the submissions phase, many people told us about what they saw as overreach and intrusion from the Premier's private office. We saw examples of that in the Operation Daintree report, which also reflected that this was not unique and that this was a more widespread problem. Specific examples, again, I'll let the report speak for itself.
Are you concerned, I guess, about the level of transparency about what actually goes on inside of the Premier's private office?
I think that there is a broad theme of lack of transparency, I think, that comes through in this report. I don't make particular observations about the PPO, although I would just observe that it took some effort to find the number.
Bridget, you didn't find widespread evidence of stacking with Labor operatives. What do you say to a government that says there's nothing to see here?
That we found a lot more than that. And I'm very clear about what we did find and what we didn't find. The referral from the Parliament was broader than simply whether their individuals were stacked into the public service. And I think the public would expect the Ombudsman to follow the evidence wherever it led, and that is what we did. So my response back would be to say that politicisation is far more nuanced, complex, and potentially pervasive than simply a practice of hiring your political mates.
So, Chip, yeah.
Can I ask what about the suburban rail loop? I mean, you make the point that there was only so far that you could take it because of the cabinet confidentiality. Given the size of the project, in terms of the cost and also the way in which you could potentially crowd out pretty much anything else that's being built in the state, do you suggest anything as a next step in terms of a further investigation to get behind the veil of cabinet confidentiality and answer some of the questions that you were unable to in this report?
I think we answered the questions as far as we could. It is not a matter for the Ombudsman whether the suburban rail loop is built or not. But what I think does come out of here is the public can reasonably question whether its cost amounts to the best use of public funds.
Quite normalised within the government?
I think in relation to recruitment, what we found was some just pretty poor practices, also a lack of transparency. This is where record keeping was particularly difficult. I mean, there were some appointments, and we're talking about $1 million contracts over 5 years, that are evidenced by no more than an email. So I think these will raise questions, and this is where the perception is particularly important. So although we didn't find this widespread stacking, there was absolutely widespread perception of politicisation, and not just a one-off. And the perception itself is damaging. It's damaging in that it undermines confidence in the neutrality of the public sector, and that in itself is a problem.
Did you find, as you say, like multi-million-dollar contracts referenced by no more than an email, did you find that practices like that became normalised within the state government, not to record things, to do things a certain way that perhaps weren't the right way to go about it, but that's just the way it was always done?
No, I look. Sometimes it's just things were done in a hurry, and I accept that there are times when things needed to be done in a hurry. There were certainly instances of direct appointments of some people who happened to be former ministerial staffers, who were put into positions not illegitimately. We don't question the justification for many of these appointments, but they certainly contributed to the perception. There may be reasons for some, there may not be reasons for others. And again, it's record keeping got in the way of some of the answers.
Yeah, honey.
In your view, Ombudsman, is it possible for a fear of repercussion for a perception of politicisation to be addressed?
I think you can, but you have to go back to basics. And going back to basics means going back to these core principles of an apolitical public sector that provides frank and fearless advice to the elected government of the day. So you need to shore up the independence of that sector. So, you know, the way I propose to do this through the recommendations is starting with the head of the public service, that should be a statutory independent appointment. It may still be somebody employed by the Premier, but it should be approved by a bipartisan parliamentary committee, and that person should then be responsible for appointing secretaries and agency heads. So if you remove the direct politics from the very top of the public service, if you address the kinds of questions the problems of at-will terminations, you know, at the moment, any executive contract can be terminated for no reason at all on 4 months' notice, and that is a serious disincentive to people on those contracts to speak up.
Was there much willingness in the parliamentary secretaries that you spoke to, or the executives you spoke to move along in that sort of direction?
I can't comment on the government's response to my recommendations because I haven't received it yet. You may ask the question, I'm sure you will.
Do you think there'll be a change in culture? You talk about culture and secrecy and fear. Do you think that might change now that Daniel Andrews isn't the Premier?
Look, I can't answer that question. I simply don't know.
Sorry.
Through your evidence gathering and the interviews with public service, did you get a sense of how recent this culture of secrecy and fear is, and if so, when it started to develop? It covered, I would say that the bulk of our submissions and investigation focused on the period 2018 to 22. So, you know, it brought, you know, basically coinciding with the second term of the Andrews government. Not exclusively, but certainly that was the period that we focused on.
Who is this? Yes.
Just back on Richard's question, how much of this, you know, the culture of creeping politicisation can be shitted home to the Premier, the former Premier himself, versus like a systemic issue?
Look, I know everybody wants me to comment on Daniel Andrews. This report is not about Daniel Andrews. I mean, dare I say, it is bigger than Daniel Andrews. But I absolutely recognise that we're talking about a period of time where he was the leader, of course. And so, you know, people will make their own observations and commentary about that. And we all know that when you talk about culture, that culture starts at the top. But I do want to also make the point that this report identifies trends that we've seen around Australia. So it is not just one political party, it is not just one government. The problem particularly of over-responsiveness we have seen elsewhere, and including at the Commonwealth, and it is a problem that needs to be addressed, and we ignore it at our peril.
Yes.
Just on the appointment of department secretaries, is there a model anywhere else in Australia around the world where an independent person does that appointment as opposed to Premier?
A lot of people refer to the New Zealand model, where there is an independent head, in this case a public sector commissioner. And many people who responded to submissions described that as a good way for Victoria to go, because it would remove the politics from the process. The recommendations we make are not exactly the same, but they do derive in part from some of the independence we see in that model. So it certainly is done differently elsewhere.
But are you saying that ministers and premiers shouldn't have any say in appointments?
No, I'm not saying that. I think that is
How would they be involved?
the recommendations, and they are broad, you know, do talk about the removing the core politics from the process. Now, how the government chooses to do that, if they do that, must be entirely a matter for them.
In your recommendation, who makes the employment decision, the independent commissioner or minister/premier?
The key is the appointment of the head of the public service, which would be an employee of the. Well, that would be in the proposal that we put forward. It would be approved by a bipartisan committee, so it would carry the support of the Parliament, as it were, and then that person would be involved in other appointments. Now, the extent to which ministers are involved in that would be a matter for the head of the public service.
Precise, when you say involved, make the actual selection?
I do
Make
not
the
go
final
into that
decision?
level of detail. That is,
That's a
that,
very
you know,
key point to be vague on.
well, this is. It is. The Ombudsman could go to a lot of trouble to, you know, to write the legislation, but I think there's little point. I think, you know, it is really
It's a
important to
very precise
establish.
point. It's a key point. Who makes the final selection of secretaries?
It would be the independent head of the public service would be responsible for that.
Just a question, I guess we don't have the government's response yet, but we do have some responses from department heads. The Department of Premier and Cabinet, he says he's pleased and not surprised that there's no stacking of political figures. And then there was another department secretary that kind of dismissed the whole report and accused you of bias. I guess, are you concerned that they're just going to completely ignore everything that's in here?
Look, I'm going to have to let this report speak for itself. You know, it's a pretty weighty tome. The evidence in it is there in the public domain for all to see. I mean, my term is up in less than 4 months. I get that. They get that. I make the point that you ignore recommendations like this and reports like this at your peril. This is about, fundamentally, public confidence in some really important processes that deliver good uses of public funds.
What do you think the risks are if they don't, as you say, at their peril? Is it likely to get worse? You know, especially for new people coming into the public service, surely it's a cultural problem.
Well, I think I have addressed the risks of this. You know, there are risks around actual politicisation. There are risks around the perception of politicisation. These are risks that I think any government should take seriously and should want to address.
Yes, sorry, up the back.
Did you have the exact number for how many staff you found in the Premier's former Premier's PPO?
Well, the numbers we report on are as of June of last year, 84. And if you want the number of for the Prime Minister and New South Wales Premier, it's 50.8 and 34 for the New South Wales Premier. Again, those are 2022 figures.
Are those numbers, criticism from government is that the PPO numbers in Victoria look big because all the media advisors are employed by the PPO, whereas in other states they're not. So is it a fair comparison?
I'm simply reporting the numbers. I'm not making a commentary on them.
This is your final report, Ombudsman?
No, it's not my final report. It may be my last press conference, but it is not my final report. My term does not finish until the 29th of March of next year. I'm not planning on hanging up my boots just yet. I have a bit more in me before I end my term.
Well, just in case it is your last press conference, can I ask you broadly, how crook are things in this state?
You might have to leave that question until March of next year, because one of the last things I do intend to do is to table the report reflecting on my 10 years as Ombudsman, and this is not it.
Okay, you done?
Okay.
Thank you so much.